This is a tutorial for the Displace Selection tool you can find in my Cloth Sewing Toolbox available on Gumroad and BlenderMarket. It allows to procedurally add displacement to an edge and its neighboring vertices using local coordinate like normal, binormal and tangent, so you can tweak the look of your garment even after the simulation, without having to go back into edit mode and redo the simulation all over again. Combined with other tools, it can also enable to open areas for pockets, zippers, and so on, and it is also packaged as a subtool inside the procedural seam detail tool. So let's see how this works. So once you've added the toolbox inside the file path of your asset browser, I recommend to use the link import method, so you can just link all the assets from the toolbox and more easily update them when I release new versions. So now I can just drag and drop my Displace Selection tool onto my test mesh, and let's have a look at the parameters. First, to drive everything, I need to make a vertex group selection for the edge I want to displace. So here I just assign this to a weight of 1 and select the corresponding group as the selection input of this modifier. Then the next thing we need to make sure of is that the mesh has a proper UV map, so that means no overlap and uniform unwrapping, which is the case right here. Also, we can right away set the scale of the UV map. Right now my mesh is measuring about 13 centimeters on one axis, and the corresponding scale on the UV map is 1 unit, so I can set up 0.13 divided by 1. And the first parameter, apply scale, is just a way to implement right into the modifier the same control as when you do Ctrl A and apply scale into the world space coordinate of the object, which is pretty useful when you import Alembic caches from other softwares where you may want to rescale it, but because of the cache settings, you can't apply the scale without destroying everything. And now let's tweak some parameters. So as I showed earlier, I just selected this edge loop, and now right away I have access to a few controls to move it around. First, the normal offset, which allows to displace the selection along the normal of the mesh. Then we have the binormal offset, which moves the selection outwards from the mesh, perpendicularly to the normal and the tangent of the selection. And finally, we also have a control to change the tangent position of the mesh, which will just make it slide all along our selection. So right now it is only moving around the vertex groups we selected, but instead of having to set up weight paint to move more vertices around, I implemented a way to blur this selection right inside the modifier. And for this, you just need to increase the blur weight and add a few blur iterations. This way, all the neighboring vertices will also move around your selection in the corresponding direction, which can be pretty handy as I showed in the demo at the start of the video. Now let's reset all this, and let's have a look at all the mode selector I skipped over earlier. The first one corresponds to what we want to do into the UV space. So for this, I'm just going into the shading tab, create a new material, and add an image texture in which I will create a new color grid. Now for the mapping, I need an attribute to get my UV map. And here we just need to make sure that the UV map names are properly set up, so the name we use right here must be the same as the output attribute of this modifier, and the modifier to work properly needs to use the same UV map name you have set up in the UV map inside the data properties. Now that we have this grid to see the effect of the displacement on the UVs, let's make some displacement and see what is happening. So by default, the UV displace mode is set to move. So that means that when you are moving your mesh, the UV will be moving around, which will be the equivalent of just stretching and deforming your mesh. But you can also set it to shrink or expand, which will keep the general UV coordinates of your mesh, which means that when you are doing the displacement, it will just look like as if you are shrinking or expanding your mesh, as you can see right here. So with this feature, the Displace Selection tool can also be used to shrink a mesh island. The next parameter is compute mode. So this allows to choose in which space we want to do the displacement of the selection. So as you can see right here, my mesh is deformed along the side. But as I explained earlier, the selection will be moved in direction depending on the normal, and the binormal direction is facing outward of the mesh like this. Which means that if the displacement becomes too great, the selection will just be moved along this direction and might go outside of the mesh, as you can see right here. And this is because by default we are moving everything in the object space, which we are seeing right here. But if we set this to UV space, all the displacement will be done on the flat version of the mesh in UV space and then projected back on the 3D version of the mesh, which means that all the movements done in the binormal direction will be confined to the surface of the mesh, as you can see right here. So this is really efficient when the binormal offset has a negative value. And on top of this, you can still use the tangent and normal offset, of course, but they will be based on the position computed by the binormal offset into the UV space first. Then the next selector box is endpoint correction method. So here let me set it back to none and object space to better see the effect of this. So as you can see on the top view, by default all points are moving in a direction perpendicular to the tangent of the selection, as you can see right here, which might work nicely and look fine for all the points inside the mesh, but for the endpoints we might want them to move along the edges of the mesh islands. So these points need to be confined to this edge right here, which you can do by setting the endpoint correction method to nearest edge direction. And as you can see right now, the movement of this endpoint is confined to the right direction, which might be better in some cases. So this method is quite simple to compute, but it also raises some issues as the other points are not confined to the edge either. As you can see right here, we are only correcting using the nearest edge direction, which is this one. That's why I implemented a third method, which is edge curve sampling, and this basically takes all the edges of the mesh island, converts it to a curve, and allows to move all the points so they are confined to this curve. And as you can see, this can work really well. You might have to play around with the UV scale. Now the final parameter is curve reverse threshold, and this is just a parameter which is used under the hood to correct the direction of the curve on which everything is based. So this is because when Blender is converting a set of vertices to a curve, it might not always set it into the right direction. But for my tool to compute the correct direction facing outwards and tangentially, I need to fix the curve direction to make sure all the binormal directions are facing outwards. And for this, under the hood, I am moving around the curve in one direction and checking if it is still inside the mesh or not, in which case we can reverse it. And this threshold value is just a really small distance by which we move everything around to fix this direction. So you might not have to change this value, but if you are seeing some issues, it may be worth playing around. And finally, let's move on to the output attributes. I already talked about the UV map output, which allows to output the edited UV coordinates of the mesh if you use the UV displace mode, shrink or expand. Then the next attribute, called displaced, which is set by default to the lowercase displaced word, is just a boolean field with the value set to true if the point has been moved by the modifier. And then we have the usual processed island, which is also a boolean field for all the mesh islands where some points have been tweaked. So here, if I duplicate a few points to create a new mesh island, those will have the process value set to false because no points have been moved on this selection. And this is already it for this really simple Displace tool. If you still have any question about this tool or the asset pack, make sure to leave them in the description below, so I can improve the documentation and the asset pack in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.